everyone. Welcome to the Over Under Movies podcast, the show where we take a prominent figure or franchise in the world of filmmaking and ask the simple question, are they overrated or are they underrated? I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, DeAngelis. He is the Dr. Lawrence Gordon to my Adam. Dylan, welcome.
Just Adam. Happy to be here, Jason.
I'm glad you're here, too. And then we're joined by a very special guest today. It's my friend Rhianna. Hello.
Hi, I'm Rhianna Malas. I'm your dead body in the corner that doesn't get up until the end of the movie. I am writer for Collider.com, and I have loved this movie for a very long time. So it's really awesome to be on the podcast. My good close friend Jason and my new, slightly further away friend Dylan.
Perfect. Yeah, you're actually not the first Australian to be on the podcast. We had another Australian guest back in May, my friend Izzo. She did our Mad Max podcast.
Of course.
We thought it was very important to get an Australian for this one, Jason. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about Saw, the first Saw, which launched the Saw franchise. So we chose Saw. Actually, pitched this to me like over a year ago at this point, and I was like, yeah, we'll get to Saw eventually. We'll do it for a Halloween, and Halloween is here.
And not only is it Halloween, it's actually the 20th anniversary of the first Saw film.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
That's also why we're doing it. No, you're so right. Because we look at the release schedules.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up to when we were going over our schedule like a month or so ago. I was like, right. Saw's getting a 20th anniversary re-release.
Sometimes we'll do re-releases and stuff. So this is in theaters again, or it's coming out, or maybe it just happened. Either way, Saw.
Yeah, I think it's in theaters right now. I mean, it's like limited, but yeah, you can see it in theaters right now.
Cool. So, Rhea, you said you love this movie. Why don't you tell us why you wanted to talk about it today?
So, okay, I didn't always love this film. I think the first time I ever saw it, I was like 13 or 14, seeing it at my friend's house during a Halloween party. We saw 1 and 2, and the whole time I was like so terrified because I knew of the film's reputation. Like, oh god, this film is going to be really gory and horrible. But, years later I revisit it, and I think there's definitely a lot there to talk about as far as, Saw is such like a foundational film as far as like it started so much in the modern horror sphere, especially in the 2000s. It definitely, before even Wolf Creek came out like a year later, it did reintroduce Australian creators into the horror sphere. James Wan and Leigh Whannell are both Australian. They're both actually RMIT graduates, which is the university I went to, which is part of the reason why. So they actually met at RMIT, and, they did the short film, Saw 0.5, and of course that got picked up, and they were given a little more of a budget, and thus Saw was born.
Yeah, that is very exciting for this to be like kind of an underdog story where, first of all, like you said, these guys are Australian. America wasn't producing a lot of films with Australian creative teams behind it. So for them to get a short film, you said they made that originally during college?
They did. Well, at least they at least met during college. I'm trying to remember whether or not they made Saw 0.5 in university or if they did it slightly after. They did meet or at least go to the same university, which was really, really cool.
That's pretty dope.
Yeah, and they did Saw 0.5, which is like a short film that they did as like, I mean, we see it a lot with movie directors in their early films that they'll do a shorter version of the first film they want to do as like a test, basically, to see if they can get like additional funding to like actually do the full movie, and that's exactly what happened here.
Mm-hmm. And that especially happens in like horror. I feel like the horror space.
Oh god, yeah. Or even films that like are just short films on their own, like Lights Out and stuff, that work perfectly fine as short films, will get like the feature length treatment, whether well or usually not well.
Yeah, and that's the thing. This one, I would say, came out well. Like, the short film, I imagine, was like just about two guys in a bathroom for 7 minutes.
Actually, Saw 0.5 is basically the entire reverse bear trap scene in the first movie. You just essentially replace Leigh Whannell with Shawnee Smith as Amanda, and yeah, that's the first film. They just had the reverse bear trap scene, which is why it is kind of my favorite Saw trap. I think I've written an article about it before. It is the best Saw trap in the film. Just it's so important to the franchise. It's the first Saw trap. It's one that keeps coming up. It's great as like a piece of memorabilia. It is a wearable prop that you can just keep on a shelf. So yeah, that was the scene that they used to introduce the whole franchise. So they expanded the plot with two guys in the bathroom. That is Adam and Dr. Lawrence Gordon, who are played by Lee Winnell and Carrie Elways.
Yeah, and they were great. Yeah, that first trap, the reverse bear trap, is definitely the most iconic. It's simple. It's on a bunch of the posters, and I feel like it's a really easy Halloween costume. So it makes sense that you think it's the best, and it makes sense that it's what they would use to pitch this movie. And Dylan, while we were watching it, you mentioned that they made a functional reverse bear trap. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a real working version of that device.
They used that in that first short film. That's the one that they that was the real one that was on Lee Winnell's head in the original short film. Obviously, when they were given like an actual budget, they were able to make one that wouldn't pop open Shawnee Smith's face.
Yeah, that's hilarious that they would even create that technology to that could actually unhinge your jaw and kill you. But anything for art.
Yeah, that's like
Anything
a whole different
for art.
level of safety issue on set.
So yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of sort of moving parts in the story, and I think in a way it introduces a lot of concepts that will be like further expanded as you get into 2, 3, 4, etc. The way that there's like the trap plot, and then there is the police story, and then there are the flashbacks that sort of incorporate and connect both scenes. So I feel like that's almost revolutionary in the fact that, like, in horror, the police are usually like this non-entity. They're either like completely useless, or sometimes they are like on the bad guy's side, but they're never like, it was uncommon to see active police work in a horror film, one that is actually advertised as a horror film. It's why I connect Saw a lot to the film Seven, how that film is like very much a horror. It is a deeply like terrifying and quite disgusting, gory film. But of course, it's like marketed as a psychological thrill because of the prestige. But I put Saw, even like, because they had to sort of work around their small budget. Saw, you sort of remember how like not upfront Saw is, I guess, how inexplicit Saw is with their more gory scenes. They usually shoot away from it, or, you know, use that really frenetic, cutty editing to like sort of show as less as you know, as little as possible. Yeah. And I do remember Seven being more explicit than that in some scenes.
Yeah, I think we can talk about that now. Saw, as a franchise, kind of has this reputation of being like torture porn, being really gory, and being like explicit in its violence. So I think people sometimes forget that this first one does cut away a lot, and it does rely more on like what you don't get to see on screen for its horror.
I think Winnell was like, so obviously everyone knows the big scene where, you know, Lawrence Gordon is like sawing off his own foot. And I think, like, yes, you see some blood, but a lot of that is very sold by like Lee Winnell freaking the hell out in the corner, like, oh god, no. And yeah. I mean, listen, everyone sort of makes fun of Lee Winnell's acting in that film. I thought he was actually really good. I think his Australian accent was very well hidden. Oh, yeah. And I think that he sold the scenes that needed to be sold.
Yeah, him screaming was good acting. Like, his regular talking
really
was
mental,
fine. Yeah, but like you really feel the horror and the terror in that man's screams, which is what you need for a horror movie. Let's summarize the film. Dylan, do you want to give us a quick summary?
Yeah, so Saw is about two guys who are chained up together in a bathroom, and they don't know what's going on. And the plot slowly unravels the reasons for why they're in that bathroom and how the two men are connected to each other. We learn Carrie Elways is this doctor who is like not a very good husband and father. He's cheating on his wife. And Lee Winnell is playing a guy that he gets hired to take pictures of people that are being unfaithful in their marriages, or he's a professional voyeur. And these two guys get collected and chained up in this bathroom by this guy named Jigsaw, who is technically not a serial killer, as they mentioned in the movie, because he never actually does the killing. He sets up situations where people basically kill themselves. I should note, this is a concept that is not held strictly to in the later films in this franchise. It's kind of hit or miss. But yeah, this whole thing is like a game to him. He says, I want to play a game, and then they basically have to go through this worst escape room ever to try to get out of this bathroom. And from the audience side of things, it's really cool because, yeah, this first one isn't as much about the gore as it is the mystery of, like, who is this guy? Who is Jigsaw? And the movie does a really good job at faking you out over the course of the movie and thinking that Jigsaw could be different characters. There's obviously the one guy, the guy from Lost, I forget his name.
Zep Hindle, who the orderly at the hospital.
And
I
that
watched
guy,
this film like last night.
yeah, we watched it last week, and that guy, you think that he's Jigsaw, and you think like the movie kind of like gives away the plot by the end of it when like he's just like out and out doing the bidding of Jigsaw, but really he's like a henchman. He's also like got his own game that he's playing. And then the end of the movie, spoilers, has like one of the greatest reveals in like modern movies, where
when the corpse like gets up and he like takes off the gunshot wound on his head, and then you're like, oh shit, it's the cancer patient from the very start of the film.
Yeah, because there's not two people in this bathroom. There's actually three people. There's a dead body, a seemingly dead body in the middle of the room with a gun in its hand and seemingly, a gunshot wound to the head, and there's just blood everywhere. But in reality, I don't know. Did he like drug himself? Was he sleeping? I don't know how he stayed completely still. I don't know if that's ever explained.
Yeah,
but he's completely motionless for the entirety of the runtime until the very, very end of the movie when he gets up and he says game's over and he slams the door on Lee Winnell and he's just screaming as they roll credits.
Yeah, so they explain it in another movie, but there's a movie where a guy has a key behind his eye and he's drugged for that. And then they explain that the body in this movie, it was the bad guy drugged himself with the same stuff that they used to sedate that guy. So that's a magic drug that lets you sleep for the exact amount of time that you need to and then get up, no problem.
Wow,
as like detailed as they get with like the engineering of the saw traps, they use a lot of wind moon logic when it comes to the chemistry that they will use. Like when people are coming out of like, getting knocked out with like chloroform or anesthesia or whatever, they're always like, oh. Like, that's generally not how it works. If you've been in surgery before, you know that you're probably not going to have the faculties to get out of a death trap when you are coming out of anesthesia. And it's very strange considering how, I guess, detailed the engineering and, like, the engineering of, like, the entire escape room situations tend to be. In the second film, there's, like, he's releasing sarin gas. Like, he very explicitly says, like, the subway attacks in Tokyo, and it's sarin gas. And apparently there's, like, antidotes in syringes. Long exposure to sarin gas straight up does not work like that. It is several times more lethal than cyanide.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of suspension of disbelief required for any of these movies. This one, to my knowledge, maybe keeps it the most grounded. I haven't seen the other Saw movies, but I read the plot summaries every Halloween. Because when I was a kid, I was too scared to watch these, but I was interested in the story. But yeah, this first one, I think the main trap is so simple. It's two guys who are just locked up, right? There's no torture devices on them. Well, they are getting shocked occasionally. But besides that, relatively simple.
But they still introduce the idea that traps will be a thing through basically every other victim in the film. Mm-hmm. Especially Amanda. So just because we don't hear a lot, outside like the tape. Well, actually, we don't see a lot of Jigsaw, but we do get to know who this guy sort of like is in the abstract of like, okay, so he's clearly this like guy who can engineer a bunch of traps. Like we learn this is his philosophy. Like the tapes are such an important part of like building the character before we even meet him.
Yeah, the movie does a very effective job at making you know who Jigsaw is without like literally knowing his identity. You understand his motivation and you understand how he's picking his victims, which is important to understanding like any serial killer. He is specifically targeting people who appear to no longer value their lives. They are like wasting the gift of life that was given to them, whether they're a drug addict or they're some other type of degenerate person.
Or just, or just straight up depressed.
Yeah, or they're a fat guy. That means you're not valuing your life, unfortunately. You gotta crawl through the barbed wire.
Yeah, Jigsaw's criteria for his victims is a little bit weird. It's kind of just whatever the movie needs it to be, or whatever James Wan thinks will be fun to see. I do think it's interesting, like, you can put it together in this movie, like, okay, he's a cancer victim, and that's why he's got this whole psychology about valuing life, but they really don't necessarily spell it out in this movie. They kind of save that for the sequels, it seems like.
The backstory really builds and builds, sequel after sequel, until you're like, okay, so what the fuck? What if that? Okay, but if that didn't start it, if the cancer started, and if that didn't start it, oh, okay, so it was this. Oh, wait, hold on. You've always kind of just been this way.
Right.
Yeah, we could talk about the sequels real quick here. Rhea, I don't know if like you're a huge fan of the sequels or not.
I like them more than other people do, I'd say. I think when you're like in the fandom, you're a little more forgiving towards the sequels because you like the characters. You know, you end up really getting to know and liking, you know, the other apprentices, the police characters. And I think that is something that has gone unappreciated in time and like is more now. Something that they do establish in the first movie is that, like, yes, while like the one scene wonders or like maybe not everyone in the traps really like get their time to like shine and be sympathized with, you will give a shit about these characters. You will give a shit about like Lawrence and Adam in the bathroom, like, you know, fully having like mental breakdowns because like Lawrence's family is like held hostage while this is happening. You'll give a shit about the cop. You'll give a like the cops are like given time to like show that they are friends. So it right. Sucks when one of them dies.
So for anybody curious listening at home and you're wondering like, hey, how many Saw movies actually are there in this franchise?
10.
Between 2004 and 2010, there were 7 Saw films released. They released a Saw film a year from 2004 to 2010. So that's Saw.
If it's Halloween, it's Saw. That was like
Saw
the big
2,
slogan.
Saw 3, Saw 4, Saw 5, Saw 6, and then Saw 3D in 2010.
Which was the finale for the franchise.
Yeah, and then the franchise went away for 7 years and came back with Jigsaw in 2017. And then Spiral, which is like what, like a spin-off film? That's the one with Chris Rock?
It's a spin-off, yeah.
Spiral,
it's like
the Book of Saw. Yeah.
That movie probably lost money, actually. These movies are pretty profitable. We'll get into that definitely when we talk about overrated, underrated. And then Saw X, and then Saw 11, that is coming out next year.
Huh.
So Jigsaw is like sort of this weird side story, and you'll be surprised to know that like I say Jigsaw is the one that people talk about the least, as far as I have observed within like moving in the fandom sphere. It's not even that it's the worst one. I think that people just like, there are a lot of things that were just sort of twists that were sort of slid in there that were like, okay, we were given no context to like any of this. It was still like fine. It was still like a fine film, you know. It's had all the things that you want out of a Saw film as far as like traps and stuff. Jigsaw, so Spiral from the Book of Saw, people talk about a bit more. I think it does a lot of really creative ideas of the franchise, like essentially putting it in the, you know, in the sort of modern day, like a world after Jigsaw where like maybe some people would be more inspired by his actions, how the world of true crime and the world of like criminal investigation changes after a case like that. And then Saw 10, I think, takes place between the first and second film. It brings back the characters that the people really got, like the audience got really close to, like John Kramer, Amanda. So I feel like the direction they're going of like having sort of mid-calls, I think is actually kind of a good approach. It's very much like, hey, you like these characters? Here you go. Take them.
Yeah, and it's really unique when we compare it to like other major horror franchises, because correct me if I'm wrong, but every single movie in this franchise is in the same continuity, correct?
It is, yeah. There aren't really any reboots, like even if they're not occurring at the same time, they're occurring within the same timeline, the same world. And I think that expanding universe, I mean, it works because it's such a grounded horror film. It's about this one string of murders. You know, there's no like, and when someone dies, they stay dead. And if you want someone to not be dead, you use flashbacks or jump back in time.
Tobin Bell, I guess, spoilers for anybody that cares about spoilers in the Saw franchise. He dies at the end of Saw 3, right?
He dies in the third, end of the third. He was dying anyway. That was like an established
dying of
part of his
cancer,
character.
Yeah. And then he comes back for, I believe, almost every subsequent film after that.
Every subsequent film, except for Spiral, he comes back in like flashback form, which I think is good. I think it's important that like you always bring it back to like, because there's not a huge lot that we learn about John even by the third films. They always bring the back of like, okay, so this is how this guy roped into it, this guy got roped into it, this is what his wife is doing. He doesn't just like, it's important that he doesn't just disappear after he dies and is never seen or heard from again. And I think that's what makes him like genuinely, to me, one of the most compelling characters in horror cinema. He's actually one of my favorite characters of all time. As much as I think his philosophy is bullshit, but I also think that is the point, that he has like this really strong conviction despite like every single contradiction of his conviction. He'll still like hold really fast to it and believe in it even when it like doesn't work.
I think that's a good choice for like favorite character. In terms of like 21st century horror movies, I would say Jigsaw has to be like the most iconic, that's the most baked into the current culture. Is there any other horror franchise you can think of with a character as iconic from Jigsaw from the last 24 years?
24 years? I mean, like the Babadook, gay icon, the Babadook.
Babadook is a gay icon.
Art the Clown from from Terrifier. I don't like Terrifier. Art the Clown is a star. I don't think it's like the marker of quality, but a marker of quality of like a horror film or a horror franchise really is like, do they make a star? Do they have this really strong mascot that people will be dressing up as for Halloween? Do they have like this one really iconic? And of course with Jigsaw, with like the Saw franchise, they have several like real like icons and mascots. Like one is the reverse bear trap, 2 is Billy the Puppet, 3 is the pig mask. Like they had really, one thing that they had over like films like Wolf Creek or Hostel is like they had these really strong like franchise markers that you could make merch of. I mean, not like marketability was obviously like not the priority there, but it was definitely a feature that they have all these like really strong like figures of, yeah, this is like our franchise, it's part of it. So then you have like Billy the Puppet in Fortnite, and you have, you know, Dead by Daylight, the escape room in London. That's actually something I really would love to touch on, about how Saw got, as our friend Lexi would say, a renaissance. Yeah, I loved it. I loved when you said that, especially, and I think that was due to the conception of like the escape room as like a really big new thing, and that happened, I think, around the 2010s, where like everyone, like there are escape rooms everywhere now. And as soon as that happened, like the one thing that people associated with like escape rooms and Halloween was Saw. So we didn't actually get like an attraction at Universal for Halloween Horror Nights till like 2009. And then it reappears in 2017. And then you had the attraction in London as well. And then you have them appearing on Dead by Daylight and Fortnite, etc. And I feel like they already had the building blocks there as far as like achieving that mimetic status.
Yeah, it's all true. Yeah, this franchise is massive. I didn't even realize that there were multiple themed, like licensed themed escape rooms for Saw, but that makes perfect sense. And yeah, like you said, this movie predates the popularity of escape rooms.
One thing it also predates the popularity of is true crime. I think the way Saw would have really sung, and the way it does sing now in the world of true crime podcasts, in the world of true, like that being like this massive craze of people like doing these long form documentaries about serial killers. I think once I was doing like a project for university where I was talking about this, and I was supposed to make like a short film to establish the point. You were on it. It was like the short thing where I was like, okay, it's a story about these true crime podcasters talking about the Saw murders within the universe of Saw. Like the way they could do that now, of like doing like a BuzzFeed Unsolved style true crime podcast just retelling the story of Saw
That's a great
really
idea.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they haven't done that already. I love a narrative.
I'm surprised they've done that either.
Yeah, you should do that. You went to that school that they went to. You could probably get them to fund it. The school, not
hit them up.
one. Yeah. This thing also has 2 like licensed spin-off games that are both. I read the plot summaries for those when I was bored. They sound awesome. You make choices. You're put in the saw traps. The first one follows the detective from the first movie. He somehow survives getting shot in the chest and is immediately put into the saw traps.
Yeah, that guy's the first movie is low-key a superhero movie because that guy, he goes through some damage.
He gets his throat slit. He gets shot.
So Detective Tapp was like, Tapp and Singh are such likable characters, and like it does suck that like neither of them, unless we're counting the games, neither of them sort of lived past that first movie, because it's like, so Singh, I was genuinely a little sad when one of the detectives died, because he seemed like a nice dude.
Yeah, he was a good friend to
like
his partner.
ACAB, but he seemed like a nice dude.
Oh shit.
No, yeah, it would be like if me and Dylan were or if we were podcasting really hard and then one of us got shot by a shotgun. Like it would be sad.
He got shot by a bunch of shotguns.
From the ceiling. From like, yeah, and like one of my sort of favorite scenes in the film, there are people like online who ship Lawrence and Adam, is like the one part where like, you know, they're basically like the door is open and then they're like Lawrence is like losing blood. He's like, I've got to go get help. I'm gonna get it and we're both gonna be okay. And they're like sort of like cuddling.
Yeah. And they put their heads to each other. They're like, I'm gonna be back for you. Yeah.
He does not come back for Adam. He dies in that. He dies in that fucking bathroom.
Spoilers for the Saw franchise. And I am very familiar with the story of Saw, but Adam gets mercy killed, I think by Amanda later. And Dr. Lawrence Gordon becomes an apprentice of Jigsaw.
As one does.
He comes back in Saw 3D. The final shot, what was supposed to be the finale of Saw, is him dragging another apprentice of Jigsaw back to the bathroom where it all started, locking him up, and then throwing the titular Saw away from that guy so he can't get out. And because it's in 3D, the Saw looks like it's coming out of the screen directly at the viewer's face.
The Saw franchise is the ultimate you die a hero or live long enough to become a villain
fully
franchise, because that's every single character that like survives more than 1 or 2 movies just becomes a bad guy at some point. They just loop back in and become like a Jigsaw apprentice.
I think there is something interesting there about as far as the dramatic irony of John Kramer. He thinks he's rehabilitating people, he's making their life better, but the fact is like enabling more people to do what he does. Like Amanda Young from the first film gets like a really big savior complex of like, he put me in a saw trap, but he's saving me and he's helping me, and she becomes really hopelessly devoted to Jigsaw. So it does, and you know, another one starts off as like a copycat, you know, using the name of Jigsaw and using the murders to do his own murder. So it is very cyclical in nature, which I think is really, really interesting. What I think is interesting really is that like now we're getting, like Lexi said, renaissance, and talking more about like the characters, the writing, the really inventive ways they cut around the budget, because like back in 2004, people did like this film. It was a hit, but it was so shocking that I think people almost liked it not for the wrong reasons, but for reasons that aren't like really the best parts of the film. Like everyone is like, man, it's so messed up, even though it's not really messed up. Like the room is really gross, and you know, obviously someone cuts off their own leg. But like I said, the horror isn't really there maybe until Saw 2. But even then, I wouldn't even call Saw 2 totally explicit either.
Yeah, the first Saw film isn't that gory, honestly. Especially if you're comparing it to like 7. Like the 7's way worse than this. Yeah,
7 you actually see the reverse bear trap work.
Oh, that's crazy. And 7 is Saw 3D, right?
Saw 3D, yeah.
Yeah, so you see the reverse bear trap work in 3D? That's
in 3D!
I was talking about the David Fincher movie, 7.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 7 was, like, you have the room with sloth and gluttony, and you're like, Jesus Christ, like that is like a whole diorama of awful.
Yeah, like in this movie, when the doctor cuts off his foot, there's like one shot where it looks like the saw is like starting to go into his foot, and you see like the blood splatter, and then that's it. It's like a hard cut, and then the next thing you see is him like crawling, and his foot's gone, and it's clear that they just like, you know, they tucked his foot back, and they just covered the leg of the pants in blood, and like that's it. There's nothing like too brutal.
And I think it's very much, yeah. I mean, like I said, I think that people think it's gory just because, like, the cutting is, like, you cut to, like, hit, like, Lawrence, like, going absolutely mentally as he's cutting his foot off and blood is splattering everywhere, and then you cut to, like, Leonel going, no,
Yeah, it's super frenetic editing that's, like, ramping up the tension.
And I think it did trick people into thinking the film was way gorier than it was.
Yeah, having just watched it, I don't remember it being particularly gory, but I feel like, you know, a year from now, looking back on it, I'd be like, yeah, that was a pretty violent film. Saw is known for having lots of blood, which isn't really the case.
Yeah, I mean, that's where like the sequels come in a lot, because this is a franchise where if you've seen like kill montages, or if you've seen like TikToks of like the different traps and stuff like that, it's possible that like you've seen sequences of these movies without actually having seen the movies themselves, because for a lot of people the gore is such like a central selling point for the movies that yeah, it kind of just gets like lost any sort of like actual cinematic elements of the movies. That's why I was like I came away most impressed like on this rewatch, is that like I think this is actually like a really good movie, which if you look at like the review scores of this movie and like the subsequent films in this franchise, you would think that this is like one of those like bad movie franchises that just makes a lot of money, so they're just like infinitely getting sequels. And I'm sure that's part of it, but at least this first film I think is like pretty competent, pretty well made.
I think it keeps getting competent. Like Saw 2 is generally celebrated. Saw 3, like there was an arguable degradation in quality as the films went on, but at the same time, like, I know people who like those sequels. Like Saw 7 was kind of a mess, yeah, but like I feel like people were so invested in the characters that you kind of didn't want to leave them.
Yeah, and Chester Bennington's in Saw 7, R.I.P. So
R.I.P.
that probably makes it the best one.
Well, funny enough, yeah, the first Saw film has the second lowest cinema score in the franchise.
No kidding.
Yeah, let's talk about the reviews here. Go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, so the first Saw film, if we're talking Rotten Tomatoes, has a 50%, which I thought is pretty low.
It's really low.
All things considered. A lot of the times with these horror franchises, the first one's got like a monster critic score. Then you see the drop off with the sequels.
Yeah.
This already started pretty low. Saw 2 has a 37, Saw 3 has a 29, and then 18, 13, 39. Saw 3D has a 9% on Rotten Tomatoes. The highest reviews by far in the franchise is Saw 10 at 80%, which I don't think I've seen that one. So
it's the newest one.
I liked it.
I don't know if that's recency bias or people like actually.
I think it is recency bias. I think it is like rediscovering. I think because a lot of those reviewer scores aren't like retrospective. They are like what people thought of these films at the time. And I think by the sequels, especially by 7. Everyone was really burnt out on like, you know, torture porn, as uppity film critics would call it, because we already had like the Hostel films, and we had like, well, yeah, I think I don't know a lot about like the other torture porn films. Human Centipede, that's it. Like, you know, Human Centipede and Hostel.
Final Destination, you know, I would loop in there as well.
I guess as far as like the kills are creative, but like they are like Final Destination is certainly more explicit than Saw, but I also wouldn't call it torture porn because they're not really like holding on them suffering. It just has a lot of death. It is just like a gauntlet of a bad time. That's what a torture porn is supposed to be. Like, it's supposed to really hold on someone as they're just going through the worst time of their life. And yeah, that is something that is easy to get tired of.
And I think you're right about like critics not looking at this through retrospective. People are reviewing these films right after they see it. And with horror, and I think this happens when people review a lot of horror movies kind of make you feel bad. Like, you don't necessarily have a great time watching them. Your emotions, right? The goal of the film is to evoke emotions. That's the goal of any film. And these horror films, they evoke a lot of negative emotions. And I think a lot of reviewers take that and put that into their reviews. And then it's like a little bit later where they'll be like, well, I was also entertained and I felt something and I connected with these characters. So I think that can explain why these scores are rather abysmal. And then by the time Saw X comes around, we're in the middle of the Renaissance, and people kind of like these movies now. And
yeah, what score did Spiral get?
37. Yeah, all the
I don't
scores
think
are
they're
bad.
ready for Spiral. Maybe it's because like I'm in like the fandom, especially like on things like TikTok and Tumblr. Like I have a lot of like people online who I talk to who are super into all these films. Maybe we just like things that are bad. I am known to like things that are bad. So like do not take my word as gospel as like these films are secretly art. In some senses that they are, especially the first film. Like there is something very like the ending of the first Saw film, I think, is one of the greatest horror endings of all time. The way that like, they have the emotional scene at the end, and then there's this pause, and then John Kramer like gets up. Like I was like, oh, that's good. That's really, really good. I could imagine seeing this film for the first time and just being with no other context. It's 2004. And just being completely blown away by it. But at the same time, like it is a grimy, nasty sort of film at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that left an impression, whether people liked it or not. Other review aggregator, Letterboxd, which we use a lot, it's from users who are just logging movies whenever. So it has a 3.6 stars out of 5 on there, which is quite high for any movie.
Especially a horror film, yeah.
Yeah, with time and with like a wide data set, you get better looking reviews. So with that, basically the summary of the reviews is that people generally like these movies, and critics at the time were 50% on it. So with that, we'll go into our underrated, overrated argument. Rhea, I assume you're going to be arguing that this is underrated.
So mine's a little more different. I guess like at the time, yeah, I'd say that these films are pretty underrated. Right now that like we're at the 20th anniversary and people are really celebrating these films, I think it's still a little underrated as far as like the mainstream goes. But as far as like the horror sphere is concerned, this film is really crawling up to like rated. Like exactly where it needs to be, being sort of championed as like one of the most important horror films of the 2000s, possibly one of the most important horror films of all time as far as like the evolution of the genre goes. Tobin Bell's finally getting his flowers, especially for his performance as John Kramer. But I'd still say, as far as like the mainstream goes, people still have a perception of like Saw as like a really nasty, horrible, like torture porny film, and I think that's what still makes it underrated. Whenever I say I was going to come on this podcast and talk about Saw, my friends and family and general passersby were like, oh, okay, like thinking that like I was some kind of sicko for really enjoying this film. And I think this film is underrated. I think more people could watch it and have the capacity to watch it. It's really a very stressful film, but I wouldn't say it's like hugely scary, especially if we're now in a period of horror where it's like things are getting really nasty and really mean-spirited. Like when you get into things like Rob Zombie and God Terrifier, like I feel like people would now have a stronger stomach to just watch Saw and appreciate it as a really solid piece of cinema that it is, rather than just like, oh, the shit room, oh God, he's cutting his leg off.
Yeah, we did watch Saw like within days of watching Terrifier, and Saw just is a much better movie.
Yeah, on our podcast feed for anybody listening to this, like on Spotify or something, Saw and Terrifier are going to be right next to each other, so you can listen to those pods back to back.
Yeah, and you'll hear, I think this is the more energetic episode, because whether we like the movie or not, there's a lot more to talk about.
This is the more positive one, yeah. I don't think either of us were like huge fans of Terrifier.
Yeah, but speaking of that, Dylan, do you want to take the underrated argument or overrated?
I'll take the overrated.
You sure?
I'll be the bad guy again. It's okay.
Be the bad guy.
Okay, you gave us a higher score than I did, so I was ready, but actually I wasn't ready. I didn't write anything down, but so my underrated argument is I'll agree with what Rhea said. She basically laid it all out. I think, at a 50%, that's really low, and I think comparing it to Seven is really smart because they're similar movies. If Seven is a psychological thriller, which can get accolades and prestige, then Saw is also that. It's less of a horror movie and more of a psychological thriller. But because of the fact that it had no budget and,
no Brad Pitt.
No Brad Pitt. Yeah, no major stars in it. I guess Carrie Ellis is was a little bit of a star, but not to the extent of Brad Pitt. But because it didn't have those prestigious elements, it just got kind of marketed as a horror movie. And then all the subsequent Saws were properly marketed as just a straight horror franchise. But this thing, it is good. And like both of you said, the twist at the end is super memorable. Ryu said it's one of the greatest horror twists of all time. Dylan, while we were watching it, I think you just said straight up, this is one of the greatest twists in all of cinema of all time.
Yeah, I mean, because the movie fakes you out so many times and thinking that it's going to be somebody else. I mean, for a decent chunk of the middle of the movie, you think that it's the doctor, that he's going to be secretly Jigsaw the entire time.
Which he was later in the films.
If you make it far enough in the franchise, that'll prove out to be correct.
If you get to what is considered the worst in the franchise, yeah, that's the twist of that one. Another thing I think you can talk about is like, with a lot of these early successes for creative teams, sometimes it's just like a fluke. We've seen a lot of directors kind of shoot into the sky and then fall immediately. But then both of the key players here, James Wan and Leigh Whannell, have gone on to do other really fantastic projects. They've been entrusted with big budgets. They've gone on to do other super successful horror franchises like The Conjuring and Insidious. James Wan was part of the Fast and Furious franchise for some reason.
James Wan directed 2 Aquaman movies.
Fucking Aquaman.
And then Whannell's back with the werewolf movie that's coming out, I think next year or this Halloween.
Yeah, we talked about that. Like,
it's coming out
earlier
January
this week.
2025.
Yeah, I was like, hey, Leigh Whannell's doing a Wolfman movie. Guess when that's releasing?
He also did a movie called Upgrade, which I love. I think it's severely underrated. I saw that with Movie Pass. It's super simple, but it's great. He did The Invisible Man, which got some accolades. I think it's cool. Basically, Universal's Dark Universe.
Soft Freezer, yeah.
Yeah, their Dark Universe that they tried to do with The Mummy in 2017 completely fell flat on its face, and they were like, maybe we'll never use these characters again. But now they're giving 2 of them just to Leigh Whannell. So you can see that this wasn't a happy accident of a success. Like, both of these people have gone on to do really, really cool stuff, both within horror and outside of it. So it's important to look at their roots in the Saw franchise, and this first Saw, just really good movie. All right, Dylan, what do you have for us to argue?
Okay, so the overrated argument for this movie, and I should know, this is one of our harder overrateds, honestly, when you like bake in the review scores. So it's not even a film that like got a lot of awards or anything like that, or got any sort of high praise from critics. It was a film that largely, I mean, the box office really, steered the ship on like where this franchise was going to go. I guess you would say that if you're going to say that this movie is overrated, you would say that it's not actually that good of a movie, and that people watch this movie and they watch this franchise because they're sickos that want to see like blood and gore on the screen, and that's it. And any sort of like deeper connection to like the story or something like that is it's a little bit of copium, and that there are better horror franchises to watch if you're going for like deeper story structures. I would say I don't agree with that, but that is an argument that people make for these movies, is that the selling point of the movies for the Saw franchise is that there is blood and gore. If you went to a Saw movie and there was no blood and gore, you would feel like you were not getting your money's worth for your ticket for that.
When are we going to the fireworks factory?
Yeah. I think before this podcast, I would hear that argument out and I'd be like, that's fair. But I just think that's incorrect. Like, I think this just is a good movie. You rated this higher than I did. You gave this 4.5 stars. Which
I do think this one is overrated. If this was an episode on the franchise as a whole, I think the franchise overall is a bit overrated because, like a lot of horror franchises, it has one good movie and then a whole bunch of mixed stuff coming after it.
We should do a podcast on the whole franchise next year.
Yeah, we'd have to a lot of these are movies that I haven't seen.
Bring me back for it.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, we'll bring it back on. But I mean, if we're just talking about like overall, the franchise, again, also like this is low budget. The highest budget in this entire franchise is like $20 million for Spiral, which is like an outlier. Most of these movies sit in like the $10-ish million budget range. So when they make $100+ million at the box office, like they're like 10xing their budget every single time.
Yep.
These movies just print money. It's the fifth highest grossing horror franchise of all time, behind Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Scream. This is number 5, so it's like up there in the pantheon of like the greatest horror franchises of all time. And it seems like they're never going to stop making money with these. Like, it sounds like they could do this all over again. They could make another 10 years worth of Saw movies every year for $10 million, and it would just, like, every Halloween make 100 to 120 million worldwide. It's free money. It's free money making Saw movies.
Yeah. The least successful one, I think, was Spiral, which only made $40 million off the $20 million budget.
It was the least successful because it was not marketed specifically as a Saw film, and it didn't have Saw in the title.
I didn't have any of the characters. I like that. I think once again, it's the characters. The characters are the most important, especially now. Like when we're looking at the modern fandom, God, the characters are kind of one of the most important parts. And so, no John, no Amanda, no Mark, no Adam, no Lawrence. Yeah, people weren't going to be into it. It was still an interesting film with a really interesting idea, but it just didn't have the selling points that people really wanted.
But here's the question, because this is something we see a lot in horror franchises, and I'm curious if this would be feasible for Saw, is that do you think this is a franchise that it would be beneficial to have like a soft reboot for them to kind of hit the reset button at some point here with their continuity?
No.
Yeah, I don't really think so either, because they've already gone wonky. They've already seen how bad they can make these movies but still keep it in continuity. So, like, what's the point of rebooting it?
Well, the thing is,
everything's connected. Like, the soap opera nature of it is like a selling point. The fact that, like, everything's connected through a flashback, and oh no, John's evil twin, Con Dramer.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that unlike these like slasher franchises that I was just referencing, Jigsaw is just a guy. He's a guy that died in the third movie.
And so he's old.
Yeah, he's an old man. Like, so you're always stuck like jumping through hoops to kind of like come up with whatever the story the next one's going to be.
Put him in a baseball cap so that you show it's a flashback.
I know.
Shady ass baseball cap.
Yeah, he looks so young in that baseball cap.
No, I'm sure they'll figure out ways to keep it in the... Well, they could figure out ways to keep it in the continuity. Every time a new Saw movie is announced, especially between 2010 and 2017, when we had the gap of Saw movies that lasted as long as the entire franchise up to that point. When they were announcing new Saw projects, they were like, yeah, this time we're rebooting it. It's going to be a whole new movie. But they haven't done that yet, and they've been really successful. The fact that Saw X is the highest rated critical Saw, and it's all about Tobin Bell's character, is crazy. They can never leave this continuity.
They can't leave the universe. They can't leave the timeline. They can't, like, obviously with like Spiral, like being sort of okay, like it turned out fine. They can work within the universe. Like, there always has to be a universe in which, like, John Kramer, played by Tobin Bell, was a man who lived and died and was the Jigsaw killer, and here are all the accomplices. Like, I feel like you could still both reboot the franchise and live in that world. Like, even if Spiral wasn't, like, such a successful shot at it, I think the idea is still solid enough to keep doing. Either that, or just keep going with these mid-calls. Like, bring back Shawnee Smith, bring back Tobin Bell, bring back Costas Mandylor, who's American accent. He's Australian, quite peerless, same as Lee Whannell's American accent. Like, it's been argued in the past that, like, Australians are easier to do the American accent than the British are. Sorry, Carrie Elwes, always slipping through with that British accent.
Carrie Elwes' voice in this is great. It's so gruff. Crazy. It's weird. But I guess my question for the franchise would be, like, the worry would be that this falls into, like, an MCU issue at some point, where if Saw 11 is coming out in 2025 and I got a buddy that's never seen a Saw film, does he have to watch the 10 Saw movies that came previously?
I mean, it hasn't mattered yet.
Little recaps, and there's little, like, sort of, like, even at the end of the first film, they do, like, a recap of the entire film.
That's ridiculous.
It was, like, yeah.
I think it hasn't mattered yet. Like, and I think people are used to horror franchises having easy entry points and feeling like they can go in without knowing anything because hey, it's just a stupid horror movie. I want to get scared. It doesn't seem like the continuity is bogging it down. I can't say for sure because, again, I've never seen any of the sequels.
Yeah, well, it's what's interesting about like the box office gross for this franchise is that while it's good and it's a lot higher than their budget, it's like a flat line. Like there is a very specific dedicated audience for this franchise, and it's not growing and it's not getting smaller. It's staying stagnant every single release.
I'd say it's like less stagnant, more like that's consistent buyouts. Like that's like you have people who are committed to that franchise, and that I think that's Saw 10 is like very much like a we're doing it for you sort of movie. I think that does sort of address the consistent buy rates. At the same time, like while you have those consistent people watching the movie, a lot more people are playing Dead by Daylight. A lot of people are getting the merch. A lot of people are going to the the escape room in London or going to, So I think the franchise that grew bigger than the movies, like playing the video games, like that I think is what gave Saw the legendary status. And you're not seeing that with any other film that like people claim Saw is just like Wolf Creek Hostel, Human Centipede, etc. Like Saw is the only one that like has that really big capital F franchise status in the same way of Freddy, Jason, or Chucky.
Do you guys think that if you were in a Saw situation, let's say the first movie, you think you would survive? Do you think you could cut your own leg off?
I'm hopeless. No, I wouldn't hack it.
Yeah, I don't think you could
hack it.
I think I'd be able to cut my foot off. That being said, I would also do better than the doctor because I would have the wherewithal to know that I would need to tourniquet my leg after you cut it off. There's a very major artery that runs down the back of your knee down to your foot. And if you cut your foot off, that artery is just hanging there, bro. You got to tourniquet that guy. You got to tourniquet it before you do the cutting, ideally.
Yeah.
So you're not bleeding all over the floor like he was. That's why he was dying of blood loss. Like a doctor should know that. That's like a screenwriting error, honestly.
Yeah. Well, he was out of his wits, he was worried about his family and he was probably dehydrated and he had just been tortured for an hour.
Yeah, the family being kept hostage while superfluous, like it was good and they made it out okay. And they like have like several, they're like an extra scene established, like they're okay, guys. And I thought that was nice.
Yeah, I thought that was nice too.
The cutting back and forth to his family was definitely in my head. I was like, oh, they need to make sure this hits like feature length. Any of these cuts back to the family, because like anytime you're not seeing the bathroom guys on screen, you're asking yourself, where are the bathroom guys? Where are they up to?
Yeah.
Well, even you get the cop plot as well. Like it's like the cop plot and then the family plot and then also the flashbacks. This film jumps back and forwards in time like a shitload. But I think that's like that became the style and it became consistent with the franchise. And I think that the sense of style is what makes this film so good and so underrated.
I think that's totally fair. And it seems like these people have a good time working on them. That's why so many of the actors come back consistently. Lee Winnell wrote the screenplay for the first like 2 or 3 sequels. And then he and James Wan continued to produce the other one. Like all of them, I think both of their names are still attached in some sort of way, even though they have basically left the franchise at this point.
The chart of recurring actors in this franchise on the Wikipedia page is hilarious.
Let me take
It's so funny how many actors are in multiple of these movies and like how often it like skips around.
Yeah.
Like Lee Winnell is in 7 of them.
Yeah, and he dies in the first one. It's crazy. Oh, that's right. I was reading the Saw wiki, and I think a lot of these credits are just him as a dead body or flashbacks to the first movie.
Yeah, that bathroom gets a lot of work in the sequels. It's a very important bathroom.
It's one of the most, I think it's one of the best sets in horror cinema. Like, it is. They did a lot of, like, the production design of this film, like, especially considering its budget, is so good.
It's great.
Yeah, it's insane. For a movie made for $1 million, it's like getting the absolute most out of $1 million in a movie.
Using every part of the animal, yeah.
Right, absolutely. All right, so do we have any final thoughts on Saw that we want to say before we wrap up this episode?
Go watch it. Genuinely. I sincerely recommend it. I don't know what streaming services you watch in the US. In Australia, you can just watch it on Stan. Also, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I really, really thoroughly appreciate it. I'm sure that you guys will have like links to like my Collider and my Instagram, my Tumblr somewhere.
Yeah, they'll be in the show notes.
They'll be in the show notes. So give you a follow. If you want to hear me write more and talk more about horror cinema and cinema in general. And, stay tuned because I'll have more projects in the work in the future. But also, thank you very much for putting up with me for this hour and having me interrupt you guys every 5 seconds with my hyper fixating.
No, that's all good. That's what we need. That's the type of energy we need here. And honestly, you're a pro, so it was great having you on.
Oh, thank you.
Dylan, you got any final thoughts about Saw?
No. Go see the first one. Definitely. I think if just for like general movie fans, I think the
see
first
the second if you're into it too.
Or the third one, like, because the first 3 movies in this franchise kind of have like a good closed loop before they start getting into some timey-wimey stuff with the
Wibbly-wobbly,
plots.
yeah.
But yeah, it's a cool franchise. I like it, and I like that it's very much optimized for the 2000s because the traps and the sequences, they're very TikTok friendly or like YouTube friendly. You can just watch like top 10 best traps in the Saw films, and you don't need to know the context of them. You'll just like see a 2-minute clip, and that's all you need to see. But the first one's really good, and I like it a lot, and I think it's a really strong, like, true crime, like, mystery film as much as it is like a serial killer movie. So, yeah, solid. It's a cool movie, and if it's in theaters right now near you and you're listening to this, like, definitely check it out in theaters. It's worth a watch.
All right, that's going to do it for our Saw episode of the Over Under podcast. Thank you for listening or watching. Check us out on our socials. We're on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Follow us on Patreon. Give us money if you want, but we also have a free tier. You get some cool things if you give us money. You'll get your credits at the end of every episode, or your names in the credits of every episode. You can tell us what you want us to review. I think we have a tier where we're like, you can be a guest on the podcast if you're interested. But hey, chances are we'll probably just ask you to do that. Anyway.
Listen, if you want to come on the podcast and you're listening to this, you can come on the pod.
You don't need to give us $50.
It's not that complicated.
Yeah, but you can give us $50 a month if you want.
We will not say no.
Yeah, and then you can also join our Discord, where we basically post every review that we have on Letterboxd, and we talk about new movies that come out. Sometimes we'll talk about old movies. It's great fun. But yeah, thank you again for listening. We will see you at the movies. Bye.
Bye.